Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. Remember that faith-affiliated communities in Mississippi, groups who attend churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, house churches, and more, may now visit these museums free of charge in groups of 10 or more, thanks to a group from the Lilly Endowment. You can stop by the ticket desk, check the museum's website, or call the main number for details. And I hope you'll join us here at the museums at noon this Sunday, September 17th, for Community Solidarity Day, inspired by the mission of the Poor People's Campaign in Resurrection City of 1968. Community Solidarity Day will feature health screenings by the Hinds County Comprehensive Health Center, a cooking demonstration by Nick Wallace, yoga class, and other activities, and is in conjunction with our traveling exhibit Solidarity Now, the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, which is open upstairs through the end of this month. And then I hope you'll join us next week for History's Lunch when Robert P. Jones will be back with us to discuss his book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future. Today, I am delighted to welcome Euphus Ruth to present early Mississippi photographers and their cameras. Greenville resident Euphus Ruth has been a full-time photographer since retiring from his career with a public utility company. He earned his AAS in instrumentation engineering from State Technical Institute in Memphis. Ruth specializes in collodion and film photography using large and ultra-large format vintage cameras and lenses. His subject matter is primarily older architecture, cemeteries, cityscapes, and landscapes. Ruth's photography is currently on exhibit at Indigo Gallery at the Weatherby House in Greenville. Help me welcome Euphus Ruth.
Program of two museums. Today I'm going to present cameras and photographers of early Mississippi. These cameras may or may not have been used by all of the people I mentioned, but it's a good chance they used most of them. At least two of them we know for sure from research at archives that two we have here on display today were used by Mississippi photographers. These cameras were mostly all used by commercial photographers who photographed architecture, groups of people, cityscapes, landscapes. People like J.C. Couvert from Greenville, who also had studios in Yazoo City and Vicksburg. Albert Frederick Daniels of Jackson. Owen Pruitt, his brother Jim, his son Marvin, who of Columbus, Mississippi, who later Jim had studio in Starkville, and Marvin and his wife Kathleen operated a studio here in Jackson. C.P. Heine was an African-American photographer here in Jackson who used a similar camera and had a tent set up on Capitol Street where he would make portraits of people. The cameras I'm talking about today are 5 cameras that I use for film and glass plates. And they were used by the aforementioned people, plus J. McMore of Vicksburg, Mississippi, used one for most of his plate work. So when Mississippi photographers arrived on scene or headed out, they usually had a lot of gear. Uh-oh. What did I do? Oh, I see what I did. I hit that screen button. So while Chris is fixing my here we have the Pruitts from Possum Town, Columbus, Mississippi. That's O.N. Pruitt on the right, his brother Jim in the center, and Marvin on the left. And as you can see, they have plenty of equipment, and they load that car up to go on location. They photographed everywhere from Tupelo, Mississippi down here to Jackson. Two of the cameras you see are on display here today. How many of y'all know when the first landscape photograph was made? Well, this is it, and it's very grainy and hard to see, but it was in 1826 by Nicéphore Niceps of France. It was made with a camera obscura and a piece of polished pewter set inside the camera obscura, covered with bitumen of asphaltum, and it was an 8-hour exposure. After 8 hours, he used white petroleum and lavender oil to wash away the unhardened parts that were hardened by the light, and this is what he got. This is a view from his second-story window in Le Gras, France, looking down. This is the first known photograph made with a person in it. If you look down here at the lower part, there's a gentleman there getting his shoes shined. It's called Boulevard de Temple, or Crime Boulevard. This was in Paris. It was made by Louis Daguerre in 1838. Some historians say 37. And it was a 10 to 15 minute exposure. Of course, there were other people moving up and down the boulevard, but since the exposure was so long, the only person you get is the guy standing still getting his shoe shined and a little bit of the shoe shine boy. This was also the invention of the daguerreotype, which was the first reliable photograph made and the first marketable photographic process. The first camera I'd like to talk about is the Fulmer and Swing Skyscraper. This camera is called a skyscraper camera because of the extreme lift it has on the front standard in the lens board for shooting tall buildings and other landscape. It's also a very versatile camera because it has a tailpiece that'll go on it and the bellows will extend out, and many photographers use this as their camera of choice because they could do portraiture, street scenes, tall buildings, and just about any kind of photograph that would come up. These cameras were made from 1900 to the early 1920s. The one I have on display over here today that you'll see at the end of the program was made in 1918. It's a rectangle bellows, so you can move that lens board up and down, and that lens board will also drop down almost as far as it goes up. So it has vertical and horizontal swings, and the beauty of view cameras that photographers loved is all of the adjustments that you can make with a view camera that you cannot do to get a perfectly aligned photograph with a handheld camera or even one on a tripod unless it has tilt, shift, or swing. Because, you know, like when you photograph a building and you look up to do a tall building, you get the photograph back and it looks like this or something. Well, you can adjust all that with view cameras, and that's why professional and commercial photographers use those. You could, as my friend Tom Rankin says, you can right adjust what you need when you're making the photograph with a view camera. This camera was available in 8x10, 11x14, and 7x17, or special order larger sizes. And that is the size of the negative, whether it be film or a glass plate. In this model, I use an 8x10, and I contact print. So I do not use an enlarger. And most of the photographers didn't back then that used these cameras. Also, you could use an ultra-wide lens with these. Most wide-angle lenses of the day were around 70 degrees, but they made special lenses that would be 90 to 110 degrees, and a few very rare ones that would go up to 130 degrees, which we have on display over here. This is another view of the skyscraper camera, like the model I have on display over here today, and you'll see how that lens is recessed inside the front standard. Those ultra wide angle lenses were a real short focal length and a real wide, almost like a bubble lens. So this camera, to use some of those, you had to recess the lens in there so you could focus it because the bellows would not draw down far enough. This is a photograph I made in Rosedale, Mississippi. This is the oldest bank building in Bolivar County, Mississippi, and it was once the city hall. I made that with a skyscraper camera on a tripod at normal height. The tripod was about 5 feet, and I was about maybe 30 feet away from the building. So I was able to get the two-story building, the sky, and keep the lines of the building perpendicular with the ground. The next camera that I'd like to mention is a very unique camera. It's made by Corona. And all these camera companies were in Rochester, New York. And eventually, every one of them was bought by Eastman Kodak. The Corona is a very unique, similar to the skyscraper camera, but different in a few ways. It's designed for working in real close proximities and photographing tall buildings or any structures with extreme wide-angle lenses. The bed of the camera is only about 5 inches. And the rear standard will just move back and forth a little, maybe up to 7 inches, but there's, it's light, it's less than 10 pounds. The camera on the right, the lens, this was in a museum. I've only ever seen pictures of this camera until I luckily found one that was in a storage unit in New Jersey. And it's here on display today with a ultra wide angle hypergon lens. It's a German design of 130 degrees. This camera was really used in the cities. It had skyscrapers and big tall buildings, and is very useful. And there's only just a very few lenses you can use with it. This is an advertisement from an old camera catalog for the camera, and explaining the use of the lenses that would be needed for this camera and the availability of shooting in close proximity in a city. I use this camera a lot when I go to New Orleans because there's buildings you can see, but it's all blocked by traffic or pedestrians, and I can get right on the sidewalk and make a photograph with that camera. Now this photograph is in Mound Bayou, Mississippi. This is the old bank in Mound Bayou. And so there I have the skyscraper, the Corona ultra-wide camera set up about 20 feet from the front door. And then there's the photograph I made that day. So that's what all I've got in the frame. Okay, the next camera I'd like to talk about is a camera that's widely used across America and the South. And I know it was used in Jackson because several years ago I bought some old camera parts from Steve Colston. And he sold me some 7x17 parts for my camera that he had that was stuck in a garbage can in the back of his old darkroom. And I can't remember what photographer from Jackson he got it from, but it may have belonged to Pruitt or Al Daniel or anybody. This camera, most commercial photographers had one to use for banquets or groups of people, but it's also suitable for landscape and cityscape, and with a panoramic view. And the true definition of panoramic view is any format that is a minimum of 2.5 times the height. This is a 7-inch by 17-inch format, and I use it to make glass plates and film negatives with. And the other beauty about this for doing people and cityscapes is if you want a tight view and put a little longer lens on it, you don't have to get a lot of sky or anything in it, and it's real versatile. This was my first panorama camera, and I still use it today. Excuse me. It's also good for doing interiors. This is Paw Missionary Baptist Church, no longer in use, in Quitman County, Mississippi, near a little community called Barksdale. So I set about 5 rows back and just set it up in the center and got pretty much, I didn't have a real wide angle lens, I had a 70-degree lens, and got pretty much the whole sanctuary. This is in Greenville. This is one I made a few weeks ago. This is the construction of the new federal courthouse they're building in Greenville. And it's a glass negative, a collodion glass negative, that I used a 1886 wide angle brass lens on. And I was across the street in front of the old Washington Bank at the edge of the sidewalk for this one, and I was on a tripod. On the display down there, you'll see that tall tripod, and I had it at about that height, about 7.5 feet up to get that exposure. Here's another one. I was set up. I originally grew up in Bruce, Mississippi, and I was coming back home to Greenville, and I came through Grenada. And this is the old Grace Funeral Home. And I finally got a chance to come by when there wasn't a crowd there and photograph it. So as you can see, I was just set up right across the lawn, and then there's the exposure. And I was able to get the hearse in the background in the garage back there. The next camera I'd like to talk about is a real versatile camera. It's called the banquet camera. This camera was made by Fulmer and Swing and from 1915 to 1929. It was originally designed for commercial photographers to photograph large groups of people. They could get on a tall banquet tripod, stand on a stepladder, and get groups of people, hundreds of people. It was used to photograph people in Madison Square Garden, ball games, club events, gatherings. And the beauty of this camera is the front standard could tilt forward about 22 degrees. So if I wanted to photograph everyone in this room and I was standing here with a camera, I would tilt that forward and I could get the front row to the exit sign to either side and get everyone in the frame. It's also good for landscapes. I use it for landscapes. And it was also available in 7x17, but 12x20 was the one that most people used. The Pruitts use this in a lot of their work. A lot of their group shops you'll see in the book Possum Town was done with this camera. The good thing about using this photographing buildings, if you want to get a lot of foreground, it'll allow the rectilinear lines of the building to stay true when you're photographing, and you won't lose anything by tilting forward. But I use it mostly for landscape, and this is in Glen Allen, Lake Washington, Washington County, down the road from Greenville, and this is the Mount Holly ruins a few months after the fire. And I was about, maybe 50 feet away from the corner of the building when I made that. And this is a wet plate collodion black glass ambrotype. So it's a positive made in camera and developed on site. Here's another picture of the Pruitts. And ON on the left and Jim on the right. On the left, you'll see a circuit camera, which is a rotating panorama camera, which I'll talk about shortly. We have one here on the stage. In the center is that banquet camera I was just discussing. And can you imagine? I mean, I love what they put on their advertisement here. Equipment, our hobby. If it's a photograph, we can make it. So 4 cameras there. The one to the right is a Kodak 7x11. I can tell by the plate holder it's on the ground. And the one to the far right is a 4x5. And when they would go, they knew about what they were going to photograph, but what I learned from reading the book and talking to Berkeley Hudson, who wrote the book and allowed me to use these photographs for this talk today, is they knew what they were going to photograph, but they weren't always sure exactly how they would set up or what they would do. So usually they left with a minimum of 3 to 4 cameras. The next camera I want to discuss is a camera that I've come to enjoy and love using and took a while to figure out. It's called the circuit camera. The circuit camera is a rotating panorama camera. It was patented by William Johnston in 1904. It was manufactured by the Rochester Panoramic Company in 1905. And before that year was up, Century Camera Company bought Rochester Panorama. And by the way, Century Camera Company was owned by Eastman Kodak. It was later manufactured in another division of Kodak called Fulmer Swing, which is the one I have here today. It came in different sizes: a number 5, a number 6, a number 8, a number 10, and a number 16. Those numbers indicate the vertical width of the film. They would make, these cameras originally were spring wound like you would wind up an old clock, and they would rotate on a turntable on a tripod and could make, the smaller ones would make up to 180 degree or more panoramas. The number 8 and 10 and 16 could make a 360 degree panorama. And the length of the panorama was determined by the degrees it rotated, and the number 16 would make up to 18 feet of film. 16 inches tall, 18 feet long. Can you imagine? That's 24 square feet. For you digital folks out there, that's gigapixels. The thing about this camera, it has to be completely level when it's used for everything to be straight and square. And it came in kits. This is another wonderful advertisement from an old catalog I have. And it specifies each kit, size of the lens board, what comes with it, and what lenses are optional for it. And it goes on a couple of pages. The standard length of film was about 6 feet, and most commercial photographers would make 2 exposures on that, 3 feet each. Thus, you may have heard the old term yard-long photographs, and you've probably seen those from military photographs, groups of people and all. That's where that came from. This is a panorama made by Daniel here in Jackson. And you can see from the exposure, it's a little blurred, but those people are moving. So he had to be up a little on a tall tripod to have this center building perfectly aligned, straight. And the thing about a panorama camera, there was two kinds you could get back in those days, and they either rotated on a turntable or they had a lens that would swing inside a bellows for a smaller, like roll film camera. And they would make straight things bent and bent things straight. So when you see these long photographs of people, groups of people, they're arranged and posed in an arc. So it'll be equal distance from the lens as it rotates. It's 90 to 180 degrees for the exposure. Now these cameras normally, unless they were modified, had a 1/4 inch slit in the center. So as it rotated, it's photographing through that slit. So if the exposure, just say, is 1 second exposure, which, by the way, these cameras came from the factory with a 1/2 second being the slowest one. Mine's been modified for interiors, and it uses an electric motor, and I can go up to 4 seconds. But just say it's a 1 second exposure. So if you got 3 feet of film, it's a 1/4 inch slit. Every 1/4 inch is 1 second. So that's how long it takes to make that exposure. Here's another view, a little tighter view. Either he changed the lens or moved up of the same scene. So that gives you an example of those lenses that came from the factory were called a convertible lens. And for example, for the number 10, the convertible lens was able to shoot at a focal length of 10.5 inches, 18 inches, or 24 inches. And that was determined by the elements of the lens. If both elements were in, front and rear, it was the shorter focal length, or you could move one element to the back of the shutter, and it would be 21 inch or 28. So you wouldn't have to have multiple lenses. You would get the convertible lens, and they came calibrated from the factory because the gear that drives the turntable is determined by the focal length of the camera plus the bellows extension, which is how far the lens is from where the film is in the camera. And so they all came calibrated. Nowadays, when people like me end up finding these old cameras and buying them, they usually have the wrong lens, and you start using them and everything's out of focus. So you have to do a little bit of math and calculations and measuring. And thanks to a few old circuit guys still kicking around in the country, I've had a lot of help figuring all that out because it really wasn't easy. If anybody wants to make panoramas with old cameras, unless you're mathematically inclined, I suggest getting a 7x17. Here's another view of Jackson by Fred Daniel. And this went along with another group of photographs where flooding was happening. I'm not sure if that's Town Creek or what that is, but you can see the Capitol over there, but you can see the water coming up. Excuse me. So you can tell he was also in a building, maybe on the second floor or even on the roof of a second floor building when he made this exposure. Here's another one from, is that Mill Street? Is that what it is down there? The railroad tracks. This is This is me in St. Roch Cemetery in New Orleans with the really tall tripod for making circuit photographs. That's a 10-foot ladder. This is the way it looked from top of the 10-foot ladder. This is the panorama of the cemetery with the chapel, entry gate, and all of that was on a piece of film 10 inches wide and about 58 inches long. This is a photograph made by C.P. Haney from Jackson. This is a conference of the Knights and Ladies of Tabor of Mississippi. This was in Indianola, Mississippi in 1954. These are 3 different versions of that panorama. The top one being the original. The other 2 have been touched trying to make it easier to see and also to show that many of those were sepia toned in the bottom one. All the wrinkles you see in it is where this photograph was actually probably just folded up somewhere. So all of these people were in an arc away from that building. And if you look at that building, you can see it's, especially when you get down toward the third part on the right, you can see how it's turning a little bit. But this was bread and butter for a lot of commercial photographers in the South and all across the United States doing groups of people. They would come and set up and photograph these people and stay overnight. To tell you what hard-working photographers these guys were, they would stay in a hotel room, they would develop the film, dry it in front of a heater, and make prints in the bathtub, hang them to dry, get about 2 hours sleep, and the next day by lunch be at the scene where the photograph was, selling prints back to the people who are in the photograph. So, you know, if he drove from Jackson to Indianola, spent 2 days, and they would get anywhere from $1 to $3 for a photograph or whatever people could afford. If he, in 1954, if he sold it to half of those people, which would probably be 75 or 80 people, it was a good 2 days' work for him. This photograph is a panorama of Vicksburg in the late 19th century from the river. Now this one was made with a view camera making 8x10 glass plates. These are 3 8x10-inch glass plates printed together to give you this scene. Y'all have probably seen the panorama of Jackson that Yvonne Suter has made, and it has been on display in a lot of places around, and it's available in the archives to look at. That's the way he photographed. He made wet plate collodion negatives and would stitch the, or I say stitch because that's what we say today in the digital world, the prints together to get the panorama. Now the thing about making a panorama with a single camera and multiple plates is it gets a little technical and you have to know what you're doing. If you just set the camera up and just turn it on the tripod, they won't line up perfectly, which is not a problem nowadays with a lot of people because they can just scan it and use Photoshop and it'll fix it for you. But you have to set that camera and move it to the correct place for every exposure so everything will set up back then. It's determined by the nodal point or rear focal length of the lens. Now this is an example. This is a photograph of a crystal, the Model T and the equipment of Luther Hamilton from Crystal Springs, Mississippi. He was a commercial photographer that did everything, as many of them did, like landscapes, portraits, group shots. And this camera is a traditional century view camera. that had the ability to make 8x10 panoramas, 7x11, 8x10 photographs, or 7x11 sort of panoramic, and it had enough bellows extension you could use a portrait lens or tighten up to use a wide angle lens. He was taught by his uncle in Eupora, Mississippi, who was a wet plate collodion photographer who had a tent set up on Main Street, Eupora, and made portraits of the townspeople. Excuse me. This is another photograph made inside Mr. Hamilton's studio, which shows the camera on the right. That apparatus you see at the bottom below the lens is a vignetting tool. A lot of the old portraits you'd see from the 19th and early 20th century, they'd be kind of vignetted and frosted around. This is what he shot through to give you that. Now the reason it's on the bottom is because these cameras, all these view cameras, do not have a mirror in them. So when you look through the ground glass to focus, everything is upside down and backwards. So if I photographed y'all from up here, you'd be upside down. So it's laterally reversed. This also shows the enlarger he used. It shows the smaller plate back for 4x5. That's an 8x10 camera, but he can make 4x5s, and that's a 4x5 enlarger. He can make bigger prints. You see his trays for his negatives or his hangers, and the tank he would develop them in. And then there's his paper cutter for the prints. Luther Hamilton. Okay, this is another example of how a photographer would be loaded up going to work. This is E.O. Goldbeck, the godfather of circuit photography, the most well-known, popular, international circuit photographer this country's ever known. And that's him and his assistant, Sam Rothwell, excuse me. Sam Rothwell. And as you can see, they have at least 4 or 5 cameras and a couple of different sets of tripods and everything in there headed out. You can see the tripod behind E.O. Goldbeck's head. You know, I can just imagine him slamming on the brakes and that thing hitting him from behind. So that ends my talk about photographers and early cameras. I will demonstrate this circuit camera. But if you'd like to know more about early photographers of Mississippi and the cameras they use, I encourage you to come visit the archives. They have a wealth of information. And if you want something at home to learn more, I encourage you to pick up this book, O.N. Pruitt's Possum Town by Berkeley Hudson. It is just incredible view of the life of a photographer in a small town, Mississippi, who covered a lot of ground. The beauty about O.N. Pruitt, he didn't just photograph one group of people or have a certain clientele. He photographed every walk of life, every race, creed, color, religion. He did not care. He photographed everybody and was just as serious with whoever was in front of the camera. It's a really great book. I'd like to thank Berkeley Hudson for allowing us to use some of these photographs. I'd also like to thank my lifelong friend who's in the crowd, Jesse Yancey, for helping me with some research and editing on this. Jesse Yancey was the first person to put a single lens reflex camera in my hands in high school. He was also the first person to take me into a dark room in Gail Denley's journalism dark room when we were going to Ole Miss together, when we were roommates there. And it's an impression that I still carry with me today. Thank you, Lee. All right, I'm going to step over here and demonstrate this, and then I'll take any questions and also talk about any of the cameras. So as you can see, this thing rotates on the turntable. And to focus these cameras, oh shoot. I almost said it, didn't I? At least I didn't F-bomb. So this is the ground glass that comes out, and you look through here, get under the dark cloth, and photograph to set up for the photograph. So this ground glass is in the same position the film will be inside the film back. Maybe it won't fall this time. So inside here, put a 10-inch roll of film and hook it up to this drum. As the camera rotates, it turns this drum and pulls the spool across this 1/4-inch slit, and it's making that exposure every 1/4 inch, like I was talking about earlier. So those rolls of film have a paper leader on them, just like an old roll film camera. You have to load it, and you had the little window that said number 1. Well, you just know how long your leader is, and you know by the rotation of the drum how far to go till it's ready for the exposure, or ready that the film's behind the slit. And then once you set it up, now this one has been, I won't wind this one up. It's been motorized so I can do a slower exposure so I can photograph interiors. My exposures are usually more about like this right here. My girlfriend Pat Brown can tell you it takes me forever to make a photograph when we're out in the field. So that's how the panoramas like J.C. Couvert, Albert, Fred Daniel, these are the cameras they use. They both use the number 8, by the way. All right. So with that, I'll be glad to take any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Hold on, I'll bring you the microphone in just a second. Let me.
Thank you. When the camera was originally sold, what was the price of the camera?
This camera?
Yes, sir.
This camera was $200 to $300, which was very expensive back then, where the Skyscraper was like $40. But these came with a kit too, because you have to have a set of gears for whichever focal length you use, and they came with a tripod.
Where do you get film for these old cameras? Does somebody still make
Yes,
those?
ma'am. Contrary to popular belief and what the digital age wanted people to believe, Ilford never quit making film. They're in England. Kodak still makes some film and actually starting to make more at their manufacturing facility in Canada because they destroyed all the stuff in Rochester and the factories are all empty up there. But Ilford never quit making them. And for this ultra large format and circuit film, which is a special order film, well, let me first say they make everything from 35 millimeter up to an 8x10 negative you can order any day of the week. Anything bigger than 8x10 you have to order annually and put in your annual order, and they make it, you order at the end of the summer and you get it in the fall. So I use 12x20, 7x17, 11x14, and this 10-inch circuit film, which comes in a roll of 100 feet. So I have to get that order in by the end of August, and I usually have it by November.
Got a couple of questions from online. Our friend Nikki Matson asks, How difficult is it to find parts and do repairs or get repairs done on the older cameras? Do you do the repairs yourself?
I do the minor, easy repairs. I have a friend, Tom Lazaroff in Canton, Ohio, who restores, renovates, repairs, and replicates as needed for old cameras. And there's other people across the country. Parts are fairly easy. I have parts cameras. I have made a camera from a couple of cameras, so they're still out there. eBay is a wonderful source, and now with Facebook, so there's forums on different cameras and camera clubs and people, and so they're easy to find.
And we have a more technical question from John Spencer. He asks, do you make your own emulsions, and what is the ISO for your emulsions?
I do not make my film emulsions. I make all of my wet plate collodion emulsions and my collodion dry plate emulsions. I make all of my I make all of my chemicals except film is that emulsion I do not make. The emulsion I make is anywhere from 0.5 to 1 ISO. Yes, ma'am.
I think the pictures you showed of Owen Pruitt were from the 20s, and I just wonder, was he still taking pictures, well, to put it another way, was he taking pictures of school children in Jackson, Mississippi between 1949 and 1955? I know the man's name was Mr. Pruitt.
Okay, yes, ma'am. It could have been Owen, or it could have been his son, Marvin Lambeth, who started out working for, is it Hiram Studio, and then Standard Photo, and then him and his wife, Kathleen, opened their own. So I know Marvin photographed all through the 50s. I do know all the Pruitts came here into the 50s, but I know Marvin photographed up to the 80s. I believe that's correct. Berkeley would correct me if I'm wrong. He would help me on that. Lee?
How'd they process 6 feet of film in a bathtub?
They would...
In a 7-foot tub.
Well, actually, what they'd do, Lee, is they had tubs they'd put inside the bathtub. They'd take the roll of film, unspool it in the dark, sink it through the water, get it wet, roll it back and forth. Then they'd have a tub of developer. They'd put it in the developer, and since they didn't have room to use a long tray, I use a long tray. I use a 6-foot tray. They would just roll it back and forth in the developer for the amount of time according to what the temperature was, then pull it out. And a lot of times, since they didn't have to carry so much, they may not take an acid stop. They just use water as a stop bath, go in the next tub, roll it back and forth, get most developer off, and then have a tub for fixer. Then they would fix it for the 3.5 minutes, rolling it back and forth. And then they could just take those out, fill the tub up with water, and wash it in the tub. And then hang it from a coat hanger.
You mentioned that you sort of learned in high school, but where did your love and appreciation of photography and its equipment come from? How did that happen?
Oh, thank you. I really didn't I learned from Lee originally, and I'm pretty much self-taught other than 3 workshops I've taken over the years. But my love of photography came from growing up in Bruce, Mississippi. My mama had a Brownie camera when I was a kid, and under our living room couch was a box of negatives and a box of pictures. So I could look at the negative and then look at the little 3.5 by 5 photograph, and I'd go through them all the time. My first camera was, my sister and I got a Polaroid camera Mama bought us, and then later we had an Instamatic. All I knew was Instamatic until Lee, it was either his birthday or Christmas, he got a Olympus OM1 SLR 35 millimeter, and that's when I got to really hold my first real camera. So, and I've just kind of a gearhead. I grew up in my parts house, and I always tinkered on stuff and loved cameras, and didn't make many photographs for a while, make snapshots everywhere I went, and back in the 90s, I had an injury during an ice storm. I couldn't do much, so I started photographing more and built my own dark room and just went on from there. Yes, ma'am.
When did that start
Yes, ma'am. I could be wrong. Maybe late 1800s, early 1900s. Eastman came out with the Brownie, it's called the Kodak #1 or something. You know what's funny is you read a lot of the writings of these old photographers, and when the Brownies came out, everybody could make photographs, go to the drugstore, send them off, get it developed and back. It's kind of funny today, like old Luddites like me who love these old cameras. That's the way we feel about digital photographers, you know. So I guess everything comes back around.
My question is sort of similar to the developing question that you just answered. What about printing? How do you print something that's 24 feet long?
You contact print it. The beauty of a large plate or negative is you do not have to make an enlargement. You have photographic paper, sensitized photographic paper. In the dark, you lay your negative out over the paper with a piece of glass over it to hold it flat. And then you have lights. So if it's 3 feet long, you may have 1 or 2 lights. But like my printing mine is 7 feet long. I have 5 bulbs in it. And so you don't do it in series, you do it all at once. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. Or you can do it outside with a wet plate collodion or dry collodion. Any glass negative you can do outside with a sunlight. That's the way they originally did it. I've done that too. In a contact printing frame made for that size.
You mentioned that a lot of stuff in Rochester had been destroyed. Is the Eastman Kodak Museum still there?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, it is. It's a wonderful museum. In fact, I took a class on dry collodion negatives there. They have a wonderful archives. They have wonderful programs. Always have an exhibit. Their archive room, you can make appointments and go down in the basement. I mean, I got to look at glass negatives of Abraham Lincoln when I was there, you know. They have about every camera that's ever made. They have photographs and photography equipment from all over Europe and America because Eastman, when the wars started overseas, he knew what was going to get destroyed, and he started buying photographic material and stuff up overseas. So they have everything there. It's still there. The factories, buildings are empty. The manufacturing part is for film was torn down, but I think it was torn down. It's something else there now.
We have another few questions and comments from the live stream. Our friend Berkeley Hudson asks, could you talk about how the large format cameras of the past connect with, say, the iPhone panorama function?
Dang, Berkeley would ask that. Well, I tell you, here's the way I relate to it. I don't know how they connect other than they work in the same way. And the arc of the photograph and the length of the picture, well, by the iPhone's determined by only so far. But here's how I use them. A lot of times when Pat and I are out doing things, I'll say, God, that'd be a great circuit photograph or something. So I'll take the panorama function on the iPhone and I'll turn it like this. You know, most people go, well, that gives a wider arc. But to simulate the way it would be on a circuit camera like Pruitt used, you turn it just like that because it's sitting on that turntable. And so I use it to get and even before I use this camera sometimes, I use it to get a preview, to get an understanding about what it's going to look like. So it's much like people used to use Polaroid backs with their film cameras to get a proof before they started. So, you know, I think that's a beauty of the iPhone. Another wonderful thing about an iPhone is you can do that. And today, the resolution's getting better and better, and you see prints that are made with iPhones that, you know, unless you look at them close, you don't know, you know, except their color. Of course, they made color photographs with circuit cameras, too. I just use black and white.
It's very interesting. Now I've seen, photos during the Civil War, but the slavery years, are there any collections, do you know, or any
Yes,
prints that
ma'am.
were taken?
Yes, ma'am. C.P. Haney, there's some stuff in archives. He was a Jackson photographer. We had a lot of African American photographers in the South. I don't know how much for slavery. The Civil War stuff you saw was wet plate collodion. It was so slow. Everything of people was posed because the exposure is so slow. There's not much movement. But Ellie Weems from Florida, a lot of his work is in an exhibit opening at the High Museum in Atlanta this next month. He was like A. Fred Daniel. He photographed the whole community down there. And they're out there. You just got to go search for them, Like so many things from back then, only the white stuff got shown. But it's out there, and luckily a lot of people have saved it. And it's there, just not as much. As time passes by, people don't realize the negatives were the things to keep. They always worried about the pictures, but the negatives were the thing to keep. So Haney and I can't think of that other guy here that worked off Capitol Street right now. But yes, ma'am, there was some in there. There's a few of slaves. There's a lot. Maybe not during the Civil War, but early 19th century. There's a lot of African Americans in here. Pruitt photographed all of them in the community, not all of them, a lot of them, and so did a few other photographers. But there were several African American photographers who did this type of work. That's a good question. That'd be a good project for somebody to do a history as lunch on.
In the couple of minutes that you have left, could you answer for the folks on the live stream who want to know where people can see your work, and then talk to us a little bit about the cameras and equipment that you have over here?
Well, right now my website is under construction, euphusruth.com. You can see actual plates and prints at Pat and I's gallery in Greenville at the Weatherby House. It's called Indigo Gallery in the historic Weatherby House, which is the oldest house in Greenville. I have an Instagram account called Photogman Euphus, and then I have a Facebook account, and sometimes that stuff shows up there. Other places, other than other people's collections, and occasionally stuff in New Orleans gets brought out every once in a while, but that's mostly in Greenville. And at the greenhouse on South Main, music listening room my son owns. Used to do a lot of old blues photography, or photography of old blues guys I used to be friends with when they were still alive, and I keep an exhibit going in there of all that old work from the 90s. Sure. Okay, I'll just start right here. This is that Corona wide angle I was talking about, where you could do up to 130 degrees. Well, the beauty of this lens that's on here, it's called a hypergon lens. And it was designed by a German company, C.P. Gortz. And you see it looks like a little bubble. Well, it is so wide that the center of the image is a lot sharper. The edges kind of fade out. Germans, being some of the most intelligent people on the planet, came up with this idea of putting this little star fan on there. So once you determine your exposure, you want to kind of, people that work in darkroom knows what burning means, burn in the edges so it'll all be sharp. You run this fan for 8 times longer than your exposure. So if it's a 1 second exposure, you run this fan for 8 seconds. After 8 seconds, while it's exposing, you drop it for 1 second, finish the exposure, then put the lens cap back on, and you're done. So this will do up to 135 degrees. I could get right here with this camera and get all of these stairs, all of this, part of the ceiling, and a crowd if there was one on both sides. It's really wide. And believe it or not, the way I found this camera, I told y'all it's the only one I'd ever seen other than in pictures of. It was listed for this lens because they're really rare and very expensive. This lens sells for about $4,500 nowadays because there's not very many of them left. I ended up getting it and the camera for $3,000, and then I found out the camera was worth as much as the lens. I didn't know. So I got lucky. Every once in a while you get lucky. Ma'am? Oh, this is the dark cloth. So when you're focusing, you know, you have to shut out the light. So thank you for asking that. I forgot to bring that up. Probably a lot I forgot. This camera is a 12 by 20 banquet camera. It has the front standard that will tilt down to 20 plus degrees for getting groups. Like if you're in a banquet room, you got tables all the way back. So you want to get these front people and the people in the back. This allows you to do that. These are different lenses. Here's the film holder for that. So that's the size of the ground glass on the back and the sheet of film that goes in it. And these are just different lenses. This is a skyscraper camera. It has an extreme wide angle lens on it right now at 110 degrees, but it's got the capability with the bellows extension to make portraits with a portrait lens like this if I wanted to just make portraits. And these are the pneumatic shutters that were so popular back then and still today with a lot of us. And then, even though this has 3 inches of rise, the building's even taller. I use this lens that's offset so I can get a little taller. And since the bellows is rectangle the size of the standard, there's no interference inside. And this is a 8 by 10 film holder. This is an assortment of gears for the circuit camera, depending on which lens and focal length you need. And I didn't bring one that winds up, but that's the key you would wind them up with and release the spring. This is one of those rolls of film. I use it for, you can see where I've been calibrating times and stuff written on it, but and the number 10 will also, you can use 8-inch film. It's got an adjustment in it for 8-inch film. And then just different lenses. This is very important with a circuit camera. It's a lens hood that would go over the hood, over the front element, and the hood keeps from having any light flare. Because a lot of times when you're making a big panorama, it may be differences in light, or you may end up getting closer to the sun. This saves you. This is the case that holds the gears, the tripod, and the turntable. The circuit camera has its own case. And last but not least is the 7x17 Corona that I was talking about. And this is a glass plate, dry plate holder for it. And you could, just like with film holders, you could put 2 pieces of glass in it on either side, so you get 2 exposures. This lens came from Jackson, Mississippi, by way of Greenville, Mississippi, and I didn't find out until I bought it from a friend of mine, a young man that used to do all the film developing at DeVille. A lady came in one day, and he was walking out for lunch, and she had these 2 lenses in her hand. He said, "Ma'am, where are you going with those?" She said, "Well, they belong to my great uncle from Greenville, Mississippi, and I don't know, I just thought I'd sell them." Well, he bought them in the parking lot. Well, it took me 2 years to get one of them and another year to get the other one. And this is the one I made that, the image of the construction of the courthouse. So it was a wide angle that was used by J.C. Couvert in Greenville, Mississippi, then later ended up with his great-granddaughter or great-niece in Jackson, Mississippi. This is a banquet tripod that was built for this banquet camera, but I've used all the cameras on it. And it'll go up another 18 or 20 inches. And I also have one that will go 12 feet for that camera. So, any questions?
Will you stick around a little bit and let folks talk to you up here?
Sure.
Thank you all for coming today. I hope that you come back for Robert Jones next week. Help me thank Euphus Ruth for this fantastic program today.
Thank you.